So hello, a warm welcome to everybody to this evening dedicated to the memory of James Parkes. So he died 40 years ago, and this evening we will discuss his legacy, known and unknown, and we will hear from our alumni and also have some special guests. Who else than Tony Kushner, the James Parkes Professor for the Study of Jewish non-Jewish relations, could have chaired this event? So Tony, please, I'll pass on to you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and welcome everybody to what I hope will be a very special evening for us all. And it's very much, as Claire says, a sort of a product of the Parkes community across the world. And delighted to have a range of speakers who represent some of the latest work and thought on James Parkes. And we're delighted that Parkes, 40 years after his death, is still relevant and still being rediscovered. We want him to be better known, and we hope this evening and what we're going to present and all the different media we're going to do it in will help that cause. So we've got a great range of presentations this evening, and it's a great pleasure to introduce first a presentation of the and launch of the exhibition James Parkes and the Age of Intolerance, which is going to be presented by Chad MacDonald, who is the curator of this excellent exhibition, online exhibition, and Katie Power, who's been involved in creating the digital version of it. So if I could pass over to Katie and to Chad, who will introduce the exhibition.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Katie Power, and I'm the digital officer at the Parkes Institute. And I have been digitising the James Parkes exhibition that Chad curated for the last few months. So it's really great to be able to present it to you this evening as part of this commemorative event. Now, I'm only going to talk very, very briefly, as Chad is the person who knows more about the actual content here. But what I'm going to do is just share my screen for you so that you can see the exhibition itself. So let me just get that up for you. Can you all see that okay? No? Okay. 1 second. There we go. You should see it now. There we go. So you can see here the exhibition. It's actually a near enough copy of the physical exhibition that Chad curated and started presenting in 2019. With the exhibition itself, I just want to extend my thanks to the special collections team at the university, especially Karen Robson, who is the head of archives and special collection, because it's such an honour to be able to bring you the content, but also these photographs, digitising them and being able to bring them to the audience who weren't able to see the exhibition on tour is something that I'm really, really proud of. Now, I will put the link to the exhibition in the chat shortly, but just to give you an idea that when you load the exhibition, it will view like this. I highly recommend viewing it on desktop and not on your mobile because it's a much nicer experience. You'll have the opportunity to see the exhibition itself. If you want to navigate down the parts, you can do on this side here. We also have a section about the people behind it, so myself and Chad and the team, but also further reading, further videos you can watch. And if you want to learn more about Parkes, there's also suggested readings. We also have a gallery which will feature the actual images themselves if you just want to view them in high definition. So you can actually view them once it loads in their full glory, which is a really great thing to share with you. Before I do hand over to Chad, who will talk more about the inspiration, how the exhibition actually came to life, I think it's really important to highlight how great it is that we're actually getting to share the life of James Parkes with you. As Tony said, we want more people to know about Parkes. And when I was putting the exhibition together, I won't spoil it too much for you. I'm sure you're so excited. But there was a quote towards the end that really stood out to me, which was Parkes saying himself that the ultimate objective is the development of the library into a full-scale research institute attached to a university which would concern itself with the whole range of relationships between Jewish and non-Jewish worlds. And it's great to be here today as part of the Parkes Institute presenting this exhibition to you all to commemorate the legacy of James Parkes himself. And so I'm going to hand over to Chad now to talk more about this and talk more about the life of James Parkes. And I will put the link to the exhibition in the chat. It will also be all over our social media. So if you're on Twitter, that's at Parkes Institute. And I'm sure we will have it emailed out as well with our post-event email. So thank you very much and enjoy the evening.
Thank you very much, Katie. And just and Katie is one of our very valued members of our outreach team and digital officer. And PhD students who some of you will have experienced recently in our wonderful production of The King of Lampedusa. And to just briefly introduce Chad MacDonald, who's someone, as they said in Blue Peter, we made earlier, that Chad is one of our outstanding PhD students of recent years, did a superb PhD on British confrontations with the Holocaust in the post-war world, and we hope that this will be published in the future, and there's already some excellent chapters coming out of that work. Chad is an honorary fellow of the Parkes Institute and is at Manchester Metropolitan University at present. So Chad, please.
Oh, thanks, Tony. So yeah, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to talk. I'm going to talk about James Parkes in terms of his early life and early influences, picking up on some things that might be known to people in the audience, and then some things that may have been forgotten as well. And then after this, we'll seamlessly link into the next talk from Carolyn Sansenbacher. But I really wanted to start by kind of thinking about where this exhibition came from. And it really started, which feels kind of a lifetime ago now, when I started my PhD, which was co-supervised at the University of Southampton by Tony in 2015. And as you'll know, if you visited Southampton's Avenue campus, if you walk through the front doors shown here, and you kind of find your way into the heart of the building, there's this quote which is shown on the wall, which reads, "The real lesson from the conduct of the persecutors is that a society has a positive task to safeguard and maintain decency and humanity, and to recognize the evils that destroy them." And I think this is, clearly a very profound quote, and clearly a very articulate quote, which perhaps expresses better than most kind of takes on lessons of the Holocaust. And underneath the quote, it reads James Parkes. And when I first started my PhD, I had kind of an inkling of Parkes, but not really any kind of profound knowledge about who he was, or how his library ended up at the University of Southampton. And to kind of forgive my own ignorance of Parkes, I'm reminded of this quote actually from Richard Harris, who later became the Bishop of Oxford, and he's reflecting on his theological training. And James Parkes comes to give a talk during that training, and Richard Harris mentions that it was only many years later that I became aware of the true importance of Parkes, but it was symptomatic that what he had to say to us should have been, as it were, fitted in as an optional extra. And I think this is really something that strikes me, and I think it was something that helped to spur on the exhibition as well. I think there are those who know about James Parkes and know about his work and his accomplishments and his tireless activism, and then I think there are most people who don't. So I think part of the exhibition was about bridging these gaps as well, and kind of linking into what Tony said at the start of the event about the importance of kind of increasing the awareness of Parkes, which hopefully will become self-evident why that is important to do throughout this evening. So in this talk, I want to start with James Parkes' early life, because what I think it really emphasizes is that the work Parkes went on to do isn't really foreshadowed in his childhood. He writes of having a most glorious childhood. He grew up in the Channel Islands on Guernsey, and you can see kind of the idyllic kind of childhood that he had. But I think it is really important to note that the work he goes on to do it isn't foreshadowed in any way. In his childhood, he does have a tragedy at the age of 14 when his mother passes away, and early in his life he's also beset by other tragedies as well, which I'll come on to. I think Guernsey is an interesting part of perhaps the forgetting of Parkes as well. Guernsey has had its own struggles to come to terms with its with the German occupation during the Second World War, and you can see this memorial here to the Guernsey 8, which was only unveiled in 2015. So there is, and if you compare Guernsey to Jersey, there is more of a hesitancy of kind of confronting this past. I do think the knowledge of Parkes is now increasing, and if it wasn't for the COVID pandemic, it might be that this event could have taken place in the church near to where Parkes lived as a child. So I think knowledge is increasing of Parkes, but I think this has to be kind of borne in mind in part of the wider kind of contextualization of Parkes as well. As I said, Parkes' early life was beset by several tragedies. And I think of all the photos in the exhibition, this is perhaps the one that I find most poignant. So this shows James Parkes on the left-hand side in a rather dashing outfit. In the middle is his sister Molly, and then on the far right is his brother David. This must be one of the last photos of the three siblings together. David died at Passchendaele during the First World War, and Molly was aboard the SS Leinster, travelling to Ireland to recuperate from illness, and that ship was sunk. So she also perished during the First World War. So Parkes lost both his siblings during that conflict. And I will come back to some reflections that Parkes made in his own autobiography about the First World War, which perhaps we can talk about further later as well. But I do think, and when you do look at the exhibition, I think there is something about this that is a particularly striking image. So Parkes himself served during the First World War at Ypres. And as I've already said, he was left scarred by that war, and he did take time after to recuperate. And again, just to kind of emphasize this kind of part of Parkes's life, and the devastating loss of life. So obviously he lost both his siblings, and he also lost half of his Sixth Form peers as well during that conflict. Which again, I think kind of underscores the loss of life at that time as well. So after the First World War, Parkes goes to the University of Oxford, to Hertford College, which is shown in this image here. And Parkes is an interesting time at Oxford. There is talk about him being appalled about the use of the anti-Semitic slur Jew boy that's kind of bounded about within college life, which really appalls him. And there is some talk if whether it is his time at Oxford that kind of starts to kind of push him in the direction of where his future life work would go. But I'm not sure how kind of definitive we can be on that. For a more positive take on Oxford, there is this poem that Parkes produced, which is in his autobiography, The Voyage of Discoveries. where he talks about the chaplain of Hartford. The chaplain helps to introduce Parkes to the student Christian movement, which Parkes joins after he graduates from the university. And it's through this movement, and I'm kind of condensing a story which I think Caroline might pick up more in her talk. But he joins the student Christian movement and then the International Student Service. And this takes Parkes particularly around Central and Eastern Europe. And he gets involved in organising different conferences. And he does actually write a book about conferences, which is another one of those kind of tangential asides, which I think it just adds to the kind of remarkable picture of Parkes and the remarkable range of activities he gets up to. But apart from that tangent, I think what's really particularly important about Parkes's work at this time is through his travelling around Central and Eastern Europe, he detects this rising anti-Semitism, particularly on university campuses and within German academia in particular. And again, I'm condensing a story here. But I think what is really significant is that Parkes, in identifying this, is that he is at least a decade ahead of his time in identifying the rising anti-Semitism. And I think perhaps what makes it particularly important is that in 1926, Parkes is ordained in the Church of England. So I think that adds a particular dimension to the fact that Parkes noting this rise in anti-Semitism. And we get another reflection from Parkes's autobiography here, where he talks about his ordination in 1926. And in reflecting in his autobiography, he mentions that his ordination was not based on any desire to escape from the contemporary world, but was tied to the conviction, which I shared with so many of my generation, that we had to discover the moral foundations of a way of life for the whole world, which would make a repetition of the war impossible. And I think what's particularly important here is this focus on the contemporary world. And I think this comes across in lots of Parkes's different writings, where he talks about the contemporary world. He talks about taking practical steps. And I think it is really important when kind of thinking about Parkes and his work, that there is this dual connection between his work as a scholar and a prolific scholar. He writes over 400 publications, but this is very much tied to his work as an activist as well. And I think we have to see those parts, that they are, what make Parkes Parkes. And I think that is really important to emphasize. And again, so when we see this a bit here when Parkes is talking about in 1959, when he's saying that he knew nothing about the Jews, and his knowledge of Judaism came from the Norman equipment of an Oxford-trained theologian. So when he started his work in Geneva, he knew nothing of the post-biblical history of the Jews or Judaism. So again, you see that link between his scholarship and his activism. And indeed, Parkes goes on to produce his doctorate, which you can see in book form here, so it later becomes the book, The Conflict of the Church and the Synagogue. And in this book, Parkes uses a mass of primary materials to suggest that the foundational Christian teaching at the root cause of modern anti-Semitism. So it's a very important book, although it doesn't attract the attention that it should have done when it was published. The Oxford University Press declined to publish it, so it's published by Sonsino, and only 2,000 copies are produced. But it is a very important book and a very important part of Parkes' scholarship. So I've hinted and I've talked about Parkes' scholarship and his work in activism. And I think it's important to emphasize that there was real danger in the work that that Parkes was involved in, and I think we shouldn't gloss over that. I think this is perhaps the most well-known incident, the so-called Geneva Incident. And to summarise it, because I know Caroline is going to build on this, but when Parkes was moving out of his flat in Geneva to come to Bali in England in the early 1930s, his assistant is helping Parkes to move. And his assistant is mistaken for Parkes, and he's beaten by some Nazis due to Parkes's work, and his assistant is left with lifelong debilitating injuries. So that again is a shortened summary of that event, but it does highlight that there was real danger to Parkes's work and to what he was doing, and that I think we must keep that in mind. And you can see that this incident is one of the moments when Parkes does become known. These are clippings from the British press about this incident, and it was also reported around the world as well. So I think this is one time when Parkes does get featured in newspapers and in the news. So as I said, Parkes comes to Bali in 1935, and this is his beautiful cottage in Bali, which actually played host to the exhibition when it was on its tour, which was a remarkable part of the exhibition's tour. And in working in Bali, what's striking about Parkes is that he never holds a formal university position, and indeed, while he's ordained, he never has his own parish either. When he's in Bali, his work is particularly supported by Marcus Sheaf of Marks and Spencer's fame. And Parkes sets to work as a gentleman's scholar. I think that's how it's normally referred to as. What I think is fascinating about this house, though, is that it's not Parkes being remote from the outside world. Again, the activism and his scholarship come together. And before, during, and after the Second World War, Parkes's home is alive with activity. From his home, he's involved in Christian, Jewish, and civic organisations that help to bring approximately 80,000 Jewish refugees to this country, which I think is remarkable. And then after the war, there's incidences of survivors of the camps coming to Parkes's home and writing their memoirs from his home as well. And he writes, I think this is recorded in his autobiography, but he talks about, people in different rooms writing different projects and engaging in different ways in the mass of materials that he's collected in his life. So it's very much a hive of activity and a hive of bringing research and activism together, which I think is really important to note. Again, this is perhaps a more famous example in terms of the refugees that Parkes helped. So Alexander Teich, who was a friend of Parkes that he met from Vienna, and who worked for the World Union of Jewish Students, and is the grandfather of the actress Rachel Weisz. If we ever get a Parkes biopic, I think Rachel Weisz should star in it in some form. But Parkes helps to get Teich to Bali and gets him settled there. And Rachel Weisz's mother writes to Parkes and asks, well, how did you help get my father here? And he just says, well, Norman Bentwich and I had to get him quickly out of Vienna. And he doesn't elaborate. He doesn't give himself praise. And one thing he does actually do is destroy a lot of his files when he's concerned that there could be an invasion of the country, so that the people he was helping were protected. So I think that gives kind of perhaps that adds to some of the patchiness of what we know about Parkes's works. But I think it is important just to really emphasize once more the activity that he's involved in. And if we contrast that to individuals who are more well known than him, I think that there is that kind of remarkable parallel in the fact that Parkes isn't as well known. Coming to kind of to the end of my part of this event, then there's this quote from Parkes's tribute from the University of Southampton when he's awarded an honorary degree. And the citation talks about Parkes being a scholar in an age of unreason, an individualist in an age of conformity, and a tolerant man in an age of intolerance. And this is the quote that inspired my title of the exhibition, James Parkes in an Age of Intolerance. But if you look through the exhibition, you'll see each of these aspects kind of threaded throughout the exhibition. There is an example of Parkes rolling his eyes at the official launch of the library at the university, and he does bemoan at various points kind of the kind of management of the university in not kind of capitalizing on the library as quickly and as he would like. So one thing that was really important about the exhibition was to bring it to different places throughout the country, and you can see just some examples of the exhibition here. So we've got Southampton at its launch in 2019 in the top left-hand corner. We've got Winchester Cathedral in the top right-hand corner. Down in the middle, we've got West London Synagogue, and then the far side at the bottom, we've got the church in Bali as well, where the exhibition went. So it was really always the hope to take the exhibition around the country to, help raise awareness of Parkes and show the many facets of his life. And there were some really heartening stories of people engaging with the exhibition. And I'd like to finish with this quote from Ruth Pike from Bali, who reflects on having the exhibition in Bali and says, as we look at the world today, whether on the international stage or in our own lives, James Parkes' proactive support for European Jewry and willingness to welcome the stranger are powerful reminders of a way forward to build strong and settled communities. So this was Ruth Pike's reflections on the exhibition in 2019. And I think there were precedent then. And I think, if we look today and if we look at the news today and what's happening in the Channel, I think they are still very important today. And I think they, again, underscore the importance of Parkes's work and why he should be better known. But to now pick up the story and to kind of lead us into Parkes's work during the war years, I'm delighted to hand over to Carolyn Sansenbacher.
Thank you very much, Chad, and just also thank you so much for all the work you've done on this exhibition. And I thought that last slide where we saw it around the UK, and let's hope we can revive that tour. It's just a remarkable achievement, so thank you very much. And to introduce our next speaker, we may not have Rachel Weiss, but we do have Carolyn Sansenbacher. And Carolyn, I think, is the most advanced scholar of Parkes in recent years, and has brought an understanding and a depth to and also I think a recognition of the enormous amount of work that Parkes did that we just don't know about, and we're going to hear some of that from her this evening. And Carolyn is working on close to finishing a revised version of her thesis. And having got the title wrong in my webpage, I'm not even going to attempt it tonight, but it's a brilliant study of the world ecumenical Protestant movement and how it responded to anti-Semitism and the so-called Jewish problem in the Nazi era and beyond. So Carolyn is going to take the story forward, and thank you very much, Carolyn, for being with us.
Thank you, Tony, for asking me. And thank you, Chad, for giving that very, very, very good outline. If I might pull up something on the screen. Thank you. For some reason, it's not, okay. Sorry. I have to, please excuse me, something went wrong. Stop the share. For some reason, it doesn't want to come up. Okay. I'm afraid it's not going to come up the way it did when we checked it prior to starting. I would like to start by looking at some of the highlights of what Parkes encountered and achieved during his 7 years in Geneva, while making the point that this was the period in which the foundation for all of his future work was laid. We'll get to the next point. Sorry. Okay. Is it coming up full screen for you?
If you can select full screen on there.
I did.
If you select it at the bottom of your screen, I think it should let you.
It has disappeared.
So underneath the previews of the slides, can you see it just down?
I've checked that several. I've checked it several times, okay. And it's there. Okay, there you go. And it's refusing to go back to. Okay, can you? Sorry, I'm so sorry. Screen share. Now I've lost this. Okay. Okay. Can you see this? Can you see the chart? Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
When Parkes assumed his role as Secretary for International Cultural Cooperation in 1928, the Nazi Party had already founded the National Socialist Student League in Germany for the purpose of integrating universities with Nazi ideology. Anti-Jewish violence in European universities was a regular occurrence, and the combined effects of numerous classes in Eastern European nations, both by law and de facto, had driven as many as 10,000 Eastern European Jewish students to expatriation in search of university enrollment. Parkes' work from the beginning with ISS was thus refugee-related, for it dealt directly with the increasing anti-Semitic nationalism that was creating Jewish immigrants fleeing anti-Semitic violence and denial of university education. After Hitler came to power in 1933 and the first racial legislation appeared in April, Parkes was made head of an autonomous committee charged with developing a program for Jewish students fleeing from Germany, which later in the year became the student arm of the League of Nations High Commission for Refugees. By March 1934, some 1,325 Jewish immigrant students had been assisted by the program Parkes created. His corresponding program to mitigate university violence included a series of international conferences that brought Jewish and non-Jewish nationalist students face-to-face in mediated discussion. It also placed Parkes in the path of the Nazi Party, for National Socialist students insisted on the grounds of international student service neutrality that their spokesman be granted equal hearing at the conferences. By 1931, Parkes was arguing against anti-Semitic violence from the same podium as National Socialist defenders of anti-Semitism, such as Wilhelm Stapel, editor of a Protestant anti-Semitic journal, who became advisor to Hitler's Reich Minister of Church Affairs in 1935. As anti-Semitic violence in universities increased in 1932, Parkes published a scathing editorial in the ISS Trilanguage Journal, charging adult leaders of National Socialists in Germany, National Democrats in Poland, and the Iron Guard in Romania with abusing, and inciting nationalist students to advance their anti-Semitic goals. After Hitler's rise to power the following month, Parkes began to be publicly excoriated by National Socialist students. He still spoke out again after the onset of Nazi racial legislation, repudiating in print Germany's Aryan laws as well as those who supported them from the pulpit and the press. Parkes also refused to attend an ISS conference in Bavaria, which was unexpectedly attended by Heinrich Himmler and Ernst Brome. 1 year later, the ISS German associate who made arrangements for the Bavarian conference was taken from his Munich flat and brutally murdered in what became known as the Brome Purge. The following spring, after ISS relations with Germany had been suspended and Parkes was preparing to move from Geneva to England, as Chad indicated, his Geneva flat was occupied by Swiss police after learning that he had been targeted by Swiss Nazis. 2 weeks later, a male employee assisting with the move to England was mistaken for Parkes and seriously injured in an attempted murder that was widely reported, reaching as far as the front page of an English paper in Buenos Aires. Running parallel to all of this in these complex and dangerous years, as Chad has already mentioned, Parkes researched and published 2 classic studies that linked Christian teachings on Jews to modern anti-Semitism. The first appeared in 1930. At the same time, an official initiative for world expansion of Jewish missions was launched by the Protestant ecumenical movement, and Parkes' book undermined its arguments in crucial ways, most namely its claims that anti-Semitism could only be solved through evangelization of Jews. The second book, which coincided with ISS withdrawal from Germany in 1934, argued from primary sources that the portrait drawn of Jews in the first 3 centuries of the church laid the stones on which a structure of anti-Jewish theology was sustained through the centuries to make the claims of modern anti-Semitism credible. What this meant, as the 39-year-old scholar activist shifted from Geneva to Barley in 1935, was that he was already in his 5th year of interrelated pioneering research. When we hear Parkes historiographically hailed today as the pioneering purveyor of scholarly evidence that links church teachings on Jews to modern anti-Semitism, the pioneering dissenter of Christian missions to Jews, the pioneering insister on the perdurability of God's covenant with Jews, it is important to recognize that the foundations of all of that lay in the Geneva years that culminated in a failed Nazi attempt on his life.
Are you working today or no? Or just you're working?
Can you hear me? I am getting
Yes,
mute.
keep going, Caroline.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Beginning in 1930 and continuing until his death in 1981, Parkes argued incisively that the provenance of modern anti-Semitism was firmly rooted in Christian history. He denied unequivocally that Judaism had lost divine authority, and he refuted all beliefs and tactics associated with Jewish conversionary policy. His involvement, his work on behalf of Jewish refugees during the Barley period, his wartime collaborations with Jewish groups on post-war restoration of Jewish rights, and his increasing emphasis on the necessity of the state of Israel can all be seen as interrelated logical developments of the purpose and work that began in those 7 years in Geneva. Parkes' involvement with organizations on behalf of refugees during the Barley period, such as the Church of England Committee for Non-Aryan Christians in Germany, the Christian Council for Refugees from Germany, and the National Committee for Rescue from Nazi Terror were intermingled with his involvements with the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the Political and Economic Policy Institute, the Board of Deputies of British Jews, its Joint Foreign Committee on Jewish Reconstruction, and the British section of the World Jewish Congress. And to take a deep breath, all of it was intertwined with his ongoing research on anti-Semitism and Jewish history, as well as the initiation and advancement of Christian-Jewish relations. It should also be kept in mind that in the midst of all of this, Parkes' home, as Chad indicated, was an open door for countless persons fleeing Nazi aggressions. To look very briefly at just a few highlights of how all of this fit together before and during the war, after Hitler annexed Austria into the German Reich in spring 1938, and Jews were being rapidly excluded under a Judenfrei policy, Parkes argued the importance of a national home for Jews in Palestine to Sir Neil Malcolm, the sitting commissioner for refugees from Germany. For Malcolm, what happened in Palestine was comparatively unimportant in the overall refugee crisis, but for Parkes, it was of immense psychological importance for Jews to have it as a home of their own, for the refugee problem would only get worse as long as Hitler was in power. A few weeks later, in early November, while lecturing on anti-Semitism in Canada, the Kristallnacht pogrom of Nazi violence in Germany and Austria erupted, and Parkes was asked to stay and advise on the foundation of the National Canadian Refugee Committee. In the spring of 1939, he was invited to become part of a hand-picked Jewish group on political and economic planning to analyze ways in which immigration could be made socially and economically beneficial to refugee receiving countries. In January 1940, he began working with the British Board of Deputies to organize a committee of Jews and Christians to collaborate on the issues of anti-Semitism. In 1941 and 1942, a joint committee of the Board of Deputies and the Anglo-Jewish Association invited Parkes' involvement in their study of post-war reconstruction and the general question of equality in Eastern Europe. Throughout this period and the remainder of the war, Parkes' thought and writing inevitably connected these interrelated concerns to Palestine and the issues of Jewish settlement after the war. For Parkes, all of the options had been reduced to two alternatives: to search for areas allowing settlement of Jews, or make it possible for the maximum number to go to Palestine and the rest to have a spiritual and cultural connection with their national home. Parkes chose the latter for reasons related to his concerns since 1930. The central problem for surviving Jews would be their physical and spiritual security, which could only come from the creation of conditions in which Jews could live as Jews in an environment free of fear. To just this last look at Parkes, wherever he is. In drawing this very brief glimpse of Parkes' war years to a close, while he was indeed involved with multiple important groups all during the war, He was never the face of any organization. Parkes was the man in the mud of the trenches, prodding, provoking, and aiming his shots precisely where attention was needed. He did it over and over again from his typewriter at Barley, most likely with a cigarette in his mouth, banging out the provocative memoranda and articles he circulated to elicit debate on the urgent and controversial issues. He did it with Jewish conversion, unleashing a series in 1942 and again in 1944. He did it with the durability of the Jewish covenant and the ongoing significance of Judaism. He did it with post-war minority rights, Christian and Jewish relations, the importance of Israel as a state, and the unbearable inaction of Western allies as it became clear to Parkes that millions of Jews would not see the end of the war. Those who disagreed with Parkes, and there were many, could not write him off completely, for his reasoning could not be ignored, and neither could his tenaciousness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, for that very succinct and powerful overview of Parkes's life, achievements, and activism. And I think Carolyn's last point ties very neatly to our next session. So we'll have a chance to quiz Chad and Carolyn shortly, but we're moving on to a reading of one of Parkes's most powerful writings during the Second World War. And we're very pleased to have Philip Glasper, playwright, lyricist, composer, who's going to relay to us an edited version of a article that Parkes wrote in January 1943. And my task is just very briefly to put it into some sort of context. Carolyn mentioned the National Committee for Rescue from Nazi Terror, amongst one of the many bodies that Parkes was involved with. And this was an organization formed in 1943, operating till the end of the war. And it included Parkes, but also perhaps better known activists such as the publisher Victor Gollancz and the politician and humanitarian Eleanor Rathbone. And all three wrote powerful accounts of calls for action in this period of the very late 1942 and early 1943, when more and more news was coming to the West of the fate of European Jewry. Parkes was already in a position of privilege which he had earned for himself by the intimate knowledge of the Jewish world and the persecution of it from as early as we've heard, the early 1920s. But he kept himself informed through a variety of sources, sources such as the World Jewish Congress and its Geneva office, where information about what was would become known as the final solution came out in the summer of 1942, from the Polish government in exile, and especially the courier Jan Karski, who communicated news of the death camps and the gassing program, which was communicated certainly to Victor Gollancz and possibly directly to Parkes, but if not through Gollancz to Parkes. And Parkes, as an activist, understands very quickly the full power of what is being communicated, that the Jewish world that he knew so intimately is literally being destroyed. And so he is very aware, and working for Chatham House, as Carolyn mentioned, this sort of semi-governmental body, independent, but which is communicating Foreign Office materials. Parkes is trying to communicate to it what is happening. Every time he writes a report, he says in his autobiography, they take off a naught. So when he talks about 600,000 deaths, they report 60,000. When he talks about millions, they again take off a naught. So he is he's created this incredible knowledge, but is also aware of who has been murdered and who is left in that period. So in 1942, most of Polish Jewry was murdered. Almost all of the Polish Jews who are going to be murdered, the 3 million of them, are murdered in 1942. But it still leaves very large Jewish communities in the Balkans and Hungary especially. And Parkes is therefore not just going to, at this point, dwell on that tremendous, horrific loss, but on trying to save the remnant. And it explains the power and the energy he puts into writing this article, an article that was never published, and for reasons we are not quite clear, because he certainly would have tried to get it published, but which we can now recognize and celebrate for the achievement of his knowledge and his empathy with the Jewish world. So to pass on to Philip, who will read edited extracts from the letter.
Thank you. January 1943, we have known for years the insane hatred which Hitler bears towards the Jews. And we have experienced, even here in our own country, the skill with which he has exploited the idea of a so-called Jewish problem. In recent years, little paragraphs in the papers have been revealing the excesses to which Hitler's hatred was carrying him, as ever more and more millions of Jews came to be helplessly in his power. But amid the strident headlines of war, these little paragraphs have been forgotten. 2 years ago, Hitler began to herd the Jews of Poland into vast ghettos in Warsaw and Lublin. Thousands died of starvation. Thousands were shot in obscure Polish towns. Thousands were tortured and lost their reason. Thousands more were killed at slave labor. We read about it at the time and then forgot. Next, he began to collect Jews from the neighboring countries. There were deportations from Slovakia, from Vienna, from the cities of Germany itself. Little paragraphs only. Amidst the war news, and their impression passed from our memory. A year ago, the same policy of deportation began to be reported from other countries Hitler had overrun. A few brave Dutch men and women stood up to protect and hide the Jews who were being demanded by the Gestapo. Norwegians, Belgians, Luxembourgeois protested and did their best to protect the victims. The paragraphs grew bigger. In August 1942, just months ago, the facts almost reached the headlines. The steady surrender of Jews in France by Laval really attracted attention. The news came from just across the channel. It could be confirmed by eyewitnesses. The Catholic and Protestant churches in France, local mayors and gendarmes did something at last. Some of the French arose, and by endangering their own lives, saved many Jews. By the autumn, there were hints that in Eastern Europe, the Jews who had been taken from Holland, France, and elsewhere, in conditions of unimaginable cruelty, were systematically being massacred. But people were sated with the horrors of war, and these rumors of atrocities passed almost beyond human imagining. And then finally, last November, the news was confirmed by all, beyond all doubt. Its authenticity was accepted by the British and American foreign officers, neither of them disposed to accept such news without the most thorough scrutiny. Hitler was not only threatening, but actually carrying out his policy of destroying the entire Jewish population of Europe. 6 million human beings, from infants in arms to old men and women, were to be deliberately killed in cold blood. They were sealed into wagons whose floors were covered with unslaked lime. They were taken out in rows and machine gunned. They were used for experiments in the effectiveness of poison gases. They were electrocuted. They were starved by the withholding of all food, or their agony was prolonged by totally insufficient rations. And in the horror of this death, families were not even allowed to die together. Husbands and wives were taken away separately, and little children, none with them to comfort and console them, were herded into trains to perish by themselves. By the ghastly passions of this madman and the brutality of those who'd been specially trained to become his executioners, it is believed that 1/3 of the entire Jewish population of Europe, 2 millions of men, women, and children, have already perished. Last month, on the 17th of December, 1942, there was read out in both houses of Parliament a solemn statement prepared by the United Nations, recording their horror at this appalling and cold-blooded massacre. But all that our own government offered to do was to execute vengeance after the war. Vengeance after the war will not save a single Jewish life. Why is nothing being done? Not openly in Parliament, but in private conversations with diplomats, high officials have betrayed the reason. It is not a pleasant one for British honor. It is that these people are regarded not as men or women or even as children, but as Jews. It is whispered, if we offer asylum in our own country and the territories we control, that Hitler might take us at our word and send us all the Jews still alive in Europe, as though the prospect should terrify instead of rejoicing us. There is only one answer to that. For those who believe there is any nobility in the cause which we are fighting, we would receive them. And if there really be 3 million of them, we will thank God that we were able to save so many from Hitler's clutches.
Thank you so much, Philip, for that powerful reading of a very, very powerful document and doing it such justice. Philip has asked me to add on what Parkes, as a man of a practical man, wanted to be done. So he wasn't just outlining this, he had a plan of action. And just as an aside, I think that paragraph which Philip ended with, I wish it could be read by Priti Patel at the moment and by Keir Starmer, who I think are equally guilty of our indifference and bystander status at the moment. So what Parkes suggests is that those refugees who could be rescued, he sees a particular role for the neutral countries and supporting them. He sees the importance of the Vatican making this a big issue. And his final paragraph of what we can plan, he says, we can set up now a Council of United Nations to discuss with representative Jewish leaders to the future settlement of the Jews. Thereby, we guarantee to the neutral who may receive refugees that proper plans for permanent settlement will be made. To the timid in our own ranks, then an unsolved Jewish question will not haunt them after the war, and to the Jews that they will not be harried from pillar to post, as they have been in the past, will be able themselves to participate in the planning of their own future. And then Parkes brings us to ourselves. Every individual, and this is in uppercase, and it's something within the original of this document that you can see the power of the typewriter here and the energy and the anger when he turns to uppercase. So every individual, he says, can do his part in helping to realize these plans. If you can do no more, you can write to your MP. If you have a pulpit, speak from it. If you can call a meeting, do so. Wherever you have influence, use it. Our honor and sincerity are at stake. as much as the lives of millions of the Jewish people. And with that, Parkes ends. So thank you again, Philip, for sharing that with us. So that, I think, brings us to the end of the presentations, and we'd now like to welcome any thoughts and comments you have, either unmute yourself or in the chat, and we'll pick up in the chat. So please do any thoughts you have or any questions of all our speakers this evening. Helen, I think you have your hand up.
Oh, yes. Hi. Thank you very much, Tony. I'm just really, thank you very much to all of our speakers, actually, but I'm just really deeply impressed by the sort of material that was just read out. And I'm really struck that it was said that it's not been published. And I'm just wondering if there is a way that perhaps I don't know the broader context of the document, what else is within it, which would need checking, of course, but I wonder if there's a way for us to publish it as part of the Parkes Institute, just to draw attention to the types of arguments that Parkes was making.
And it's something that we have done a first step towards, which is it's one of on our website, we have documents that we've chosen in lots of different fields of the Parkes Institute, and I've written a sort of short commentary on it, but it is the beginning and it is on our website. But it's something I think that Carolyn mentioned, or Chad, sorry, mentioned very much, that Parkes, within that small field of those who are not just aware but real activists in the 1930s and 40s, that Parkes is a somewhat forgotten figure. We have figures that didn't claim to have done very much and yet are celebrated, those that didn't do anything at all and have been rewarded. And within that, partly one feels, well, we wouldn't want Parkes celebrated by in company of people he didn't deserve to be. But I think it's rather telling that the two figures that I would single out, James Parkes and Eleanor Rathbone, have received no recognition. And I think that's goes back to the sort of Groucho Marx line about wanting to be not wanting to be a member of a club that wouldn't have you as a member. But nevertheless, I think people have a right to hear that speech, because it is about then, but it's also about now.
I'm just mention on that, can you hear me? On the point that was just made about making it more widely known, there is an interest at the BBC in making a short film with the reading of the story and appropriate images to be shown next year for the Holocaust Memorial Day. I think you've worked, Tony, with Pete Doherty at the BBC, and he's expressed interest in doing that. So, and that might be a film that could be put onto the website in due course too.
Thank you, Philip. I think Claire has got a question.
Yeah, sorry, and I don't know, I pushed the button, red cross, but it's okay. Yeah, very, very powerful, and the echo with the relevance with what we are living, of course, nowadays is very strong. I just had well, two questions, I guess, to Chad and Caroline. One about, so you mentioned that Parkes went to Central and Eastern Europe, and I wonder if you could say a bit more about this, and did he go as far as Poland? Because I don't know if you didn't mention it, or I might have missed it. And the second question is about his scholarship or his life, and do you think that there are any aspects of it that are still not well researched and that would deserve more attention?
Well, I can speak about his travels in Central and Eastern Europe were extensive. He actually became involved with students, university students, in every European country that was experiencing anti-Semitic rises in anti-Semitic violence and problems with denying university education to Jews. So yes, he traveled very, very extensively, and I perhaps it didn't show on the sketch that some of the conferences, the furthest east conference that was actually held was in Czechoslovakia, but he traveled. He had student groups organized in Hungary, Poland, Romania. All of the problematic. Those were the three main problematic nations during that period of time, as far as university students were concerned. And of course, he was in all through Central Europe as well.
In terms of his scholarship, and kind of what can be researched more, I think there's a lot. Would be my kind of short answer in terms of what can still be examined in terms of Parkes and his life. I think Caroline's work, when it's published, will add an important dimension to that. But yeah, I think that the archives at the University of Southampton are an exceptionally rich source, and that there's a lot more that can be tapped into there. So there are two biographies that have been written about Parkes, but I think that there's a lot more that could be done to explore his work and to explore his connections to different organizations, to explore his post-war work, to explore Bali as a home and kind of as the hive of activity in the post-war period and its developments. So yeah, I think there's lots and lots of research that can be done about Parkes still, and lots of really meaningful and important research within that as well. So I don't think it would be research for the sake of it, but I think there is lots of important materials that can still be brought to light and should be done.
Oh, may I add to that just a couple very, very quick thoughts. The Parkes archives are huge. They are absolutely huge, and my most recent judgment of thinking through all of the work that I've been doing these past years is that we have barely plumbed the depths of what is there in the Parkes archives. Secondly, there's still I've encountered quite a lot of information in the archives at the World Council of Churches, International Student Service, as well as World Christian Student Federation. There's also some of the most important personal correspondence to help us understand Parkes the man. Is at University of Albany, his wartime correspondence with Walter Koch, who worked with him in Geneva, and they continued corresponding throughout the war. And these two men, well, Parkes was very close friends with Walter and his wife Enid. So there's this lovely give and take of actual sharing between the two men that we don't find so much in Parkes' correspondence on issues. One thing that I always sort of chuckle about, they very lovingly referred to him as the octopus who could put his hand and heart into 8 different projects at the same time, and no one would notice that he wasn't giving the right attention to each and every one of them. So there is a lot that we have to know. The one thing that I'm working on right now is his very, very confidential material about being asked by the World Jewish Congress to advise them on the Vatican II conversations that were going on. And so that started in 1960, and between 1960 and 1962, there's an incredible correspondence, memorandums being written, not only by Parkes, but by other prominent Jewish authorities, and they're being traded back and forth for comments. It's a very, very fascinating thing. But Gerhard Rigner made a point of meeting with Parkes in London to discuss things in person that he really didn't want to discuss in letters. So one of the results of that meeting is an actual formal how would I put this, formal contract of sort, a formal stating of an informal contract of such about what they would like from Parkes and how they would like him to advise them on how to respond to what was going on, the dialogue that was they were hoping would be taking place at Vatican II.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. We've got two hands up. First, great to see Rob Thompson, and then Victoria Barnett following. And we've also got a question in the chat. So first, Rob.
Thanks so much, Tony. And thanks so much, everyone. It's been fascinating to hear the presentations, very moving to hear that letter, and great to see the exhibition evolving into its next stages. Wonderful. My question, I guess, kind of is linked to that issue about, you know, all the other things there are to research. Carolyn, I was really struck by that slide you shared with all the names of the different organizations that Parkes was involved in. And I sort of think, you know, we often think of Parkes as this kind of, quite rightly, as a, you know, extraordinary figure and a kind of anomaly in the Church of England. I think he's still something of an anomaly in the church today for some of his, you know, some of the central points of his work. But I think that slide also illustrated that he connected with a lot of people, individuals, organizations, and I wonder if there is, you know, and forgive me if this is something you're already doing, Carolyn, but and perhaps you could share, but is there a way to trace something more of the influence of Parkes in those kind of encounters and interactions with different people before, during, and after the war? And I guess also it kind of links to what Chad said about that interesting quote from Richard Harries as well, the kind of ongoing influence of Parkes. Is there a way of joining up the dots of those relationships in order to perhaps understand more about how his ideas have penetrated a wider context?
Thank you, Rob. I would say my general answer would be yes, absolutely. Before dots can be connected between the various groups with which he was associated, I think that as I spend time in the archives and in the documents, it's very, very clear that we haven't taken each single group and their particular issue of a particular time and understood it as well as we need to do. I was also thinking the very same thing that you're asking when I made the diagram, and that I don't think that it's possible at this point. We have lots and lots of work that needs to be done. We need to understand what happened each time, and the correspondence is there. It's in the Parkes archives. We just have to take the archives and put each thing into its context, and then analyze it and analyze it and analyze it, and then get to the place where we can, as you say, connect some of the other dots.
Thank you very much, Karen. And Victoria, thanks very much for joining us and your comment or question.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has just been a fascinating and very rich discussion, and I'm eager to learn more. So 2 quick questions, I guess, for Carolyn or anyone who's delved into these archives. The first is whether Parkes had, in the late 1920s, early 1930s, meetings or contacts with American Jewish leaders who were coming over to Europe at that point because of the rise in anti-Semitism. And the second question, you mentioned Regner, and I was intrigued by that. I actually interviewed him in 2000 about his work with people at the World Council. So my question would be, did Parkes have, was it even possible in the early 1940s for Parkes to be part of that loop in some way? And did he have any kind of ongoing ties to people at the World Council like Adolf Freudenberg? I mean, my understanding was that there had been a pretty, he was, had a bleak view of humanism, but there were people at that point who were working together with Regner, and I just wonder if he was somehow part of that, even once he was back in England.
Oh, once he was back, they were in contact prior to while he was in Geneva. We know that for sure. And Parkes attended the founding conference. So we know for sure that they were in contact. When the correspondence that occurred in 1960, as far as I remember, they were at that point. There seemed to be a little bit of familiarity, but I think the nature of the topic when Regner first contacted him, and Regner did first contact him because of Nahum Goldman. Nahum Goldman was actually one of the speakers with which Parkes shared the podium when they were also sharing it with people like Wilhelm Stapel. So they were in contact during that period, but not on a regular basis. But Goldman obviously had respect for Parkes, and I think that it was his recommendation that sent Regner in search of his assistance. When the letters first came, there was more of a formal approach, but I suspected that it had to do quite a lot with the seriousness of what was being asked, and with possibly not even knowing what kind of a response might be had. Plus, would this person really keep this confidential, because it's quite a thing to say. Parkes never spoke about it. It's not in his autobiography. I was absolutely shocked when I ran across the files. There's probably a file this thick. It's very, very instructive. The other person that he was in very, very close contact with during this same period was Pawlikowski. They were exchanging back and forth articles, memoranda, all kinds of ideas, criticizing one another in a most fascinating way. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. And we've got 3 questions on the chat. We've sort of touched upon it, but I think it'd be worth revisiting. Philip asked, I'd be interested to know how James Parkes is regarded in the Church of England of his day. And I think we've sort of touched upon how he's viewed subsequently, but we can revisit that. Anushka asks if there's any possibility of having James Parkes recognised as righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem. And Paula asks, did Parkes write or speak about anti-Semitism that seems to be more race-based rather than rooted in the origins of Christianity? So I think some of this may fall upon you, Carolyn, but others please do come in. So we've got a few minutes, so if we can be relatively brief, but any thoughts of any of those three questions?
Could you just repeat the first question?
Yes, I think it was from Philip. Yes, I wanted to know how James Parkes was regarded within the Church of England of his day.
With distance, by the majority of the church, with great affection by others. Parkes had a very, very good ongoing relationship with George Bell. I have not come across any controversy between the two of them. He also had a very good and solid ongoing relationship with William Temple. It was on a completely different level. It was a more formal level than with Parkes and Bell. Some of the people that Parkes clashed with during that period was the Bishop of Winchester. They had quite a row in print during the 40s. Parkes Parkes was asked to give a sermon at Cambridge, and during the sermon, he had one of his moments where he said some things that he was very, very adamant about. He didn't like some of the responses that the bishop was giving, and unfortunately, the school printed the whole paper, and it became this very important and very interesting discussion between Parkes and the bishop for some time. There were numerous things like that, but overall, he was the John Campbell that Parkes, that Chad mentioned earlier, who introduced him to student Christian movement. He and Parkes he criticized Parkes terribly in 1942 for his concern about missions to Jews, and he accused Parkes of being too emotional about anti-Semitism. So there are lots and lots of things. We could do a whole session just on the various ideas about Parkes within the Church of England.
Thank you. And just very briefly, as time's pressing, we have been thinking about the Yad Vashem, because he could certainly, in terms of, did he save Jewish lives? Absolutely. Was his life at risk? Absolutely. Did he do it for profit? Absolutely not. So he fits the criteria, which are tough. So it's, I think it's something that we would be keen to develop and work on. And on, I think Parkes's line about, he was very aware of 19th century race thinking and how this affected, but he said it was based on the foundation of Christianity, that it was it was necessary to have that foundation for race-based thinking about Jews to develop. So he was one of the first, and I think most important, scholars of how anti-Semitism develops. And I think he would want to be remembered also as a sort of historian of the Jewish people and Jewish experience, but in terms of understanding histories of anti-Semitism, plural in both cases, I think he would certainly acknowledge that. I don't know, Chad, is there anything you would like to add at this stage?
Not really, but I hope it has encouraged people to learn more about Parkes. I think Caroline has given a comprehensive kind of overview of some of the areas that definitely should be looked into. And I think there is a lot more that should be done to raise the awareness of the public and about Parkes. So hopefully this does spur on some research and additional things. That would be great.
Thank you very much. And to thank all of our speakers this evening, for Katie and Chad for all their work, Carolyn and Philip for his outstanding reading. We are very much trying to continue the legacy of James Parkes here. Of course, none of us have any problems with university management at all. So what Chad outlined, we're very obedient. We do as we're told, and we don't ever disagree with authority. So believe that you believe anything. But thank you for a very, very thoughtful evening. I found it very, very stimulating and a really great advert for why we should be concerned about James Parkes for what he did, but also for the relevance for the future. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. And I'm just going to hand over to Claire, who will say good evening to us all, but also let us know about a very important event we have in a fortnight. Claire.
Yeah, so I've put the link in the chat to advertise the next event, which is the Montessori Lecture. So the oldest lecture at the University of Southampton, and just to also thank everybody, and Tony and Chad and Caroline and Katie. I'm so proud to be director of Parkes and of your work and your contribution. So thank you for a fantastic evening, really, very inspiring. Have a good evening all. Good.